So today, I'm not sure if you guys are aware of it or not. I would hope that you are, considering that you're here. But the topic of the panel discussion is free will. So whether or not human beings actually author decisions all the way, whether we actually author our decisions in the same way that we think we do, right? I think it matters because there's a big difference between perception of something being there and actually having that thing. Right? Also, too, it centers largely on legal or moral discussions, right? If human beings don't actually have free will, what does that mean for our ethical systems? What does it mean for our legal systems? Oftentimes, we find that free will enters our everyday discourse, and we can sometimes not give enough credence to the human condition that we inherit a lot of what is given to us, right? We don't get to choose where we're born. We don't get to choose many of the things that are just given to us. So this is ultimately why I think free will is an important topic, and it's why I wanted to have a discussion on it. Secondly, is because oftentimes philosophy, especially academic philosophy, Professor Kyle Thompson and I were talking about this, it tends to focus on really obscure topics, things that most people don't really think about or consider as relevant. So that's also the reason why I wanted to speak about this, and this is also why the survey that you guys have in front of you is going to be really helpful for us to kind of see how these discussions are helpful, if at all. Because if it's not really moving you intellectually in a direction that you feel is beneficial, then what's the point, right? So with that said, I think we're going to segue into Professor Kyle Thompson's presentation.
All right. And
we're good to go.
First, I want to say this is awesome to see this huge of a turnout for talking about philosophy. So I am so excited. I'm excited to be sitting next to these two gentlemen, and I just have to thank Chris for working so hard to put this all together. He interviewed the three of us, wrote an article to promote this in the Breeze, made the posters, everything. So just a quick round of applause. All right. So my bit here is going to be somewhat of laying the groundwork for the discussion that Dr. Falcioni and Dr. Kern will move us into afterwards. So before we start talking about what we mean by free will in a philosophical sense, I'm going to invite everyone to perform some kind of freely willed action. Whether that's raising your hand, making a noise, standing up, clapping, I don't know. Or you could freely choose to do none of those, but it'd be great if some people moved around in some way. Think, I want to do this, and just go for it. So there you go. Excellent. Excellent. The only object thrown is not at me. I'm grateful for that. All right, so remember that feeling, because part of this debate has to do with what it feels like to author an action. We do need to get into some terms, right, philosophers? Oh, what do you mean by that? So one key term that helps this discussion get off the ground is determinism. This is literally the textbook definition. Determinism is this doctrine that states that every event, every single event in the world is determined or necessitated by preceding, meaning coming before, prior events and the laws of nature. So your car's movement down the street, the changing weather, your decision to raise your hand, every event, if determinism is true, is caused, is required, is necessitated by an event that came before, which was caused by an event that came before, and so forth and so forth. So if you can see, as Newton was said to have seen, an apple fall from a tree, you can give a causal explanation, right? Gravity is pulling its force down on this object, that at a certain time the branch will weaken and the apple falls. Now, that same causal story can be told about your every decision. Your decision to come here was because you saw some flyer or someone told you about it. You were on campus because you enrolled in Chaffey, you were at Chaffey, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So there's one side of this conversation is determinism. Then the other side is exactly what I just had you do. What does your experience say? It certainly feels like, or at least most people report, feeling like you could do otherwise when you make a decision. So you raised your hand, Chris threw a water bottle, some people shouted. It felt intuitively, subjectively, as if you could have chosen otherwise, right? You did that, but you didn't have to. And that's the problem. So this slide says, what's the problem? The problem is determinism seems to say that every decision you made was predetermined by prior events and prior events and prior events. But then your subjective experience says, no, I felt like I chose and I didn't have to. All right. That is what philosophers call the problem of free will. The first flag I need to plant here in this discussion is to say subjective experience isn't reliable. And I know that somehow flat Earth has come back into fashion. I don't know. What can I say after that? But subjective experience is not always reliable. So that's the first important point that I want to get across, is that it certainly feels like the Earth is flat when you're walking around, right? Maybe this is why this view so long ago was prominent. You can go about your day driving on the streets and it feels like, yes, this is a flat Earth that we're on, but nonetheless we know from empirical evidence, we won't go into that, I think we're all on the same page, that in fact the Earth is not flat. So if you relied only on the feeling of what it feels like, you might conclude, well, I freely conduct my actions and the Earth is flat. So this means we cannot always look to our experience as a guide to truth. The classic symbol of determinism is cascading dominoes. Your every action is like a domino that is being pressed upon by a prior event, which is pressed upon by a prior event. We're going to update that a little bit, though. This is a very short video. This gentleman is going to show you the power. This is not what I loaded, but maybe someone else was using that. Here we go. I like this updated version because here we're going to see that a small domino can have a cascading effect
domino cannot
to affect a big
domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick.
Special order.
It's adorable.
And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready?
Okay, so I want to update our symbol to this cascading domino, and here's the reason why. It shows how seemingly small events can actually cascade and have large effects. So you chose to take a job in Florida. That was a big decision. You mulled over it for weeks. You talked to friends, you talked to family, you looked at the financial costs, everything, and you eventually landed on that decision. Now, if determinism is true, then part of that decision might have been influenced by very minuscule, potentially trivial parts of your history. For example, maybe when you were a kid, you heard someone saying, gosh, Florida's such a great place, I'd do anything to live there. It kind of sticks in the back of your brain and exerts a bit of causal force when you're making that decision. So let's update it to think of even little particle motion could theoretically have a cascading effect to influence your actions that seem much grander in size. I'm sure a physicist would tell me that that's an inaccurate representation, but it is a good symbol for thinking of determinism. Now, when we're talking about the problem of free will, there's 3 general, quote-unquote, solutions that we can talk about. I'll just go over them so that we have the terms down, and then I'm going to focus on one. Hard determinism says, yeah, determinism's true. It's all dominoes, no free will. End of story. Our work here is done. Let's pack up, go home. Compatibilism, in a very reductionist sense, says, yes, determinism is true. In any action that you've conducted, you could not have done otherwise. If we rewind the tape this morning when you bought coffee and hit play, you would have bought coffee. If you rewind it again 1,000,000 times over, you will always do the same thing, but you're free still. And the way that you're free is your decision to buy the coffee was not influenced by coercion. You weren't under threat. It was your motivation, your thought process that was part of the chain reaction that went into you buying coffee. And there's freedom in that. A non-free compatibilist event would be someone threatening you and saying you have to buy coffee. That would not be on a compatibilist view of free action. So notice it says sometimes we have free will. Not all choices are free on the compatibilist view. There's probably a strong portion of philosophers that are in the top category and a pretty significant in the second category, and probably the fewest are in the third category, libertarianism, not to be confused with politics, although you get interesting exam responses if you ask students about libertarianism and someone didn't do the reading. Ron Paul was a true libertarian. Okay, so on this view, determinism is false, and some events are actually caused by our minds, our decisions, ourselves. And we actually initiate some events in the world, and therefore we are free in some cases. All right, so I'm actually going to move to talking mostly about hard determinism and try to convince you of two things in a very short period of time. No free will. Sorry, that's never fun when I say that, right? But yes, we can still talk about holding people morally accountable for their actions in spite of the fact that it seems like determinism is true. And thus there's no free will. So I'm actually going to pose that whether or not determinism is true, there's no free will to be saved. So let's go one at a time. Let's say determinism, the dominoes, are true. Well, where do we get that idea? Well, when you look at nature, at the physics level, the chemistry level, at biology, psychology, we understand events to be caused by prior events, right? You go into the scientific laboratory and you draw a conclusion based on what you think happened to bring about some event. And all the natural sciences point to determinism being true. You talk to a physicist, you talk to a social scientist, talk to a marine biologist. Events happen because of prior events and certain naturalistic laws. And then here's where it gets potentially philosophically uncomfortable. We admit that our brains are part of that natural world. So they too are subject to those same laws of nature. And thus they too are shaped by prior events and so forth, back to the start of our universe. You certainly didn't, as Chris said, decide when and where you would be born and what experiences you would have to shape who you are. And so it seems like there's no ultimate free will on this view. Okay, but then we have this thing called quantum physics that starts to mess up how we understand reality. At the quantum, meaning the subatomic particle level, things get wonky. It's like Alice in Wonderland down there. And there are some events that quantum physicists say might not be determined. They might be uncaused. At the macro level where we live, though, we don't see evidence for this indeterminism. So there's one reason maybe to be skeptical of this. But even let's say we grant that there are random events at the quantum level. Random events at the subatomic level. That does not seem to grant us freedom. So for example, if your decision to take a job in Florida was the result of a random event beyond your control, it's hard to see how you freely chose it, right? Or to take a very simple example, you're back at the store buying coffee, and right before you do, someone flips a coin, and that random coin flip determines whether you will buy the coffee or the tea. There's no freedom in that. Freedom is being in control. You're deciding, you're actively choosing. So what happens to free will is it seems like a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If there's determinism, you're a domino being pressed upon by prior events. And if there's no determinism, then you're at the whim of randomness. And neither of those spell freedom, it seems, for the human being. Although we do want this precious freedom, many of us, because it seems to be how we think of ourselves in this world. And we want to take credit for the good things we've done, and we want to blame people for the bad things they've done. Maybe most importantly why philosophers like to talk about this subject, though, is that occasionally we get to correct people that are really, really, really smart, way smarter than we are, but for some reason they get things in philosophy wrong. And so that's what I'm going to do to validate my field. So this is Big Think, and actually don't use this as a discouragement. Big Think does a lot of great short videos, but they asked the physicist a philosophical question, and you can tell me if you're compelled by his argument. This is Michio Kaku.
Newtonian determinism says that the universe is a clock, a gigantic clock that's wound up at the beginning of time, and it's been ticking ever since according to Newton's laws of motion. So, what you're going to eat 10 years from now, on January 1st, has already been fixed. It's already known using Newton's laws of motion. Einstein believed in that. Einstein was a determinist. Well, does that mean that a murderer, this horrible mass murderer, isn't really guilty of his works because he was already preordained billions of years ago? And Einstein said, well, yeah, in some sense that's true. Even mass murderers were predetermined. But he said they should still be placed in jail. Heisenberg then comes along and proposes the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and says, nonsense. There's uncertainty. You don't know where the electron is. It could be here, here, or many places simultaneously. This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, hey, get used to it. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice. Every time you look at an electron, it moves. There's uncertainty with regards to the position of the electron. So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do. So when I look at myself in a mirror, I say to myself, what I'm looking at is not really me. It looks like me, but it's not really me at all. It's not me today, now. It's me a billionth of a second ago, because it takes a billionth of a second for light to go from me to the mirror and back.
All right, so he referenced the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Heisenberg, obviously made famous in the documentary Breaking Bad. Okay, so here's his argument, and it's an invalid structure. He basically is following. So if you take critical thinking, you probably had to jot this down at some point. I'll just give the short form at the bottom. If determinism is true, it seems there's no free will. That's what Einstein says. It feels good to be on Einstein's side, right? Then he says, well, Heisenberg points out that determinism is not true. Therefore, we have free will. This is an invalid argumentative structure. We can plug in some values in this to see why this is the case. Imagine I said, if I'm in Rancho Cucamonga, then I am in California. Okay. I'm not in Rancho Cucamonga, therefore I'm not in California. That seems to be wrong. You could be in San Diego, in Los Angeles, and in many other places. So he doesn't give an account of how suddenly quantum physics saves free will. Even if there is some indeterminacy, things aren't set in stone at the quantum level, where is the human freedom in that? If I don't have a control over it, I'm just where I was with determinism being true. But he does bring up an important point in the last thing I'm going to get to, which is, well, what do we do about moral responsibility? Yes, this seems to have the uncomfortable conclusion that someone that commits a horrible crime was predestined to do so. And let's think positively. Everyone always gives the negative examples. And someone that was going to cure a disease was predestined to do so, right? It cuts both ways. Well, we don't, in philosophy, decide things based on if it makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside. Or at least that's what we say we're trying to avoid. So let's look at this. Do we have to then throw moral responsibility out the window? I'm going to briefly argue, no. Responsibility is a very practical language that we can participate in. We can use words like choice and decision because it helps us navigate and communicate as social creatures. To say someone is responsible is to say that their causal chain, their domino series, brought them to perform some action. And we may not like it, and we have to respond accordingly. So it's not as though if someone wrongs you, you have to just say, well, you were predestined, so I guess I'll just be trampled over, right? You can still take actions, and hopefully by praising and blaming, praising the good actions, you can encourage future good behavior in someone, and by blaming, you can discourage negative behavior. So we might view praise and blame as strategies. If it was effective to blame a tornado, and that would reduce, or that would increase the chances that it would go away, we would do that. But it doesn't. But humans, when you blame them, they take that to heart and they change their future actions. So too with praise. So we can still talk about morality as a strategy, a practical strategy for navigating how to create a better relationship between multiple people and society at large. Here's a quick and fast example, and then I'll wrap up shortly thereafter. So what this enables us to do, this view of no free will is to then, when someone commits an act, let's go with the negative, that's oftentimes what philosophers focus on, we can then examine the situation and treat it effectively based on whatever causal series of events led to that action. So imagine that one person robs a grocery store because they are starving and so is their family. Okay? The chain of events that will have led them to do that is very different than someone that maybe is trying to rob a grocery store to get money to buy drugs. And we can therefore take that into account in working with that person to help them and help society from being harmed from them. So the person that needs food needs access to resources of a kind. They need the means to subsist. The person that is robbing a store, potentially fueling a drug addiction, needs some kind of drug treatment intervention. And it's very different strategies based on that domino effect that affected one person to do one action and another to do another. Obviously, this is a very shorthand view. I'm not going to build a moral system here in 2 minutes, but this will give you a sense that we don't have to go, well, forget it, that person just crashed into my car and drove away, I guess that's life. No, we can still as a society decide we want to discourage that kind of thing. And we want to praise good driving. And so I'll close with this. What I advocate for is most of the time you walk around and the Earth is flat and you don't have to worry about the fact that it is this large spherical thing with satellites orbiting, etc. But when you're trying to get something to the moon, out in space successfully, well, you better look at the long view and go, yes, we need to take into account that this is a round Earth. So too with free will. Most of the time it's effective and probably most practical to act as though there is free will. Hey, I didn't like when you did that. Hey, that was an excellent job you did. Right? But occasionally when designing something larger, like our entire legal system, it's probably more humane to base it around the appreciation for causal determinism. Thank you.
So I have a quick question.
Yes.
So what you're saying is that responsibility is a practical linguistic tool, right? And we can utilize that to help, I suppose, push people or nudge them in a direction that we think is amiable for society as a whole.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if something is practical, does that in and of itself make it good? That is to say, could we be misleading people? Do you think it's possible that if people don't believe in free will, that they actually commit more acts that we would consider quote unquote bad because they don't feel responsible for it?
So I think that is a large empirical question that we don't have direct access to.
Okay.
I can't imagine what a society would look like if from day one this was built into the way we talked about our relationships in the world. I guess I'd like to think that a deeper appreciation for causal determinism might produce a better society overall. And in fact, there are cases where, like for example, with drug addiction, viewing people as someone that needs an intervention of a kind rather than to be branded as a criminal that just decided to sin.
Right.
So I would like to think it would produce a more moral society, but I'm agnostic as to whether, if anyone wants to create a world, I'm happy to start. But what I would discourage is if someone runs a very brief study where they, and I think they've done this, where they say, hey, all your actions are determined, and they give you the opportunity to cheat on like a very trivial test. Someone might take that as an invitation to say, yeah, why not? Right? I don't think we can then extrapolate and generalize from that very minute laboratory experiment to what the world would look like if we started to think in terms of there being no free will.
Okay. So in your view, what the world might look like if we understood it as us not having free will, would the justice system focus more on rehabilitation as opposed to punishment?
Yes. So punishment might be a word we still use, but and I don't actually think you need to even take my system on to think that rehabilitation is a good. But it certainly does seem to point in that direction. People can be treated as human beings that need rehabilitation depending on their circumstance, rather than just the people that woke up one day and where you decided to make a good decision, they decided, I'm going to be a bad person. That's such a simplistic, myopic view of human action, I think.
Okay. What it sounds like, what you're really getting at is that as human beings and as individuals, we need to recognize that ultimately we're not quite as responsible for the decisions that we make, and as such, we should be a little bit more humble and see each other on a, I guess, more level playing field.
Yeah, and this cuts both ways. The negative actions, it may, rather than treating someone as just a bad person, you can treat them as, well, how can we best work together to prevent further harm? But the same goes to taking credit for good things, right? You might say, what's my causal history? Well, I had a family support system, I had educational opportunity. There's certain things that enabled me to accomplish the things that I want to accomplish, and I should be humbled by those just the same. To think that, Malcolm Gladwell has that book Outliers about, Bill Gates is in one of the first schools with computers, right? If he was born somewhere else to a different circumstance, he would not be where he's at. So for him to ignore that causal history is just arrogant and inaccurate. So I think we do have to appreciate where we come from, where others come from, and calculate that into being moral creatures.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I guess I'm up. I'll try to make mine relatively brief. We'll see how this goes. I'm not known for brevity. That said, so I'm arguing for sort of a middle path here, and I guess, at least in the way Kyle laid it out, it would put me in the compatibilist camp. There's also kind of a sub-genre called semi-compatibilism, and I might be closer to that, but ultimately I'm sort of challenging the whole framework, so I don't want to be considered a determinist, compatibilist, or free willist. I think there's sense in all three, and I have criticisms of all three. But I do have a more middle-of-the-road approach, right? So I do accept fundamentally some type of determinism, but I think there's some notion of free will worth rescuing or worth articulating that we can make sense of and find meaningful. That isn't just reductionistic, right? And not that that's where you're going, but I looked at you, so. So I cut out a couple slides that dealt with sort of terminology, and I'll more or less accept Kyle's way of framing this. And if Dan wants to add to it, I'm willing to discuss this, because there's a really interesting debate just about terminology, right? What we really mean by these, and in some ways there's an intellectual sleight of hand by many compatibilists, where by free will they mean something different than what free willists mean. By determinism they mean something sometimes different than what hardcore determinists, or just hard determinists generally mean. Their position is often called soft determinism, but it's different than hard determinism. So that's how I'll work with these, and if we want to discuss them, great, or if you have questions about them, great. But fundamentally, I think the free will position is, as Kyle mentioned it, that there's this condition of it being unfettered, which means not controlled. I say external, but some even include internal, right? There's nothing causally determining your actions. I think the key issue here is the second point, this could do otherwise condition. I think that's probably the best way to frame it, right? You're free just in case you could have done otherwise with respect to any given action. Doesn't mean you're always free, doesn't mean you're never free, but if it is the case that with respect to an action, you could have done otherwise. Think of it just like chocolate and vanilla. You go to the ice cream store, and you're looking at apparently just two flavors. I don't like either, but let's just say chocolate and vanilla. I should have picked things I like. Ice cream is not one of them, by the way. Sorbet. Gelato. Getting gelato. And you have lemon. No, okay. So chocolate vanilla ice cream. And causal determinists would say that all the causal factors become deterministic, right? What you've done in the past, the way you were raised, what you were exposed to, maybe the other allergies you have, who knows? But there can be, more strictly deterministic, some behavioral, sociocultural deterministic factors, but all of those ultimately compel your decision in a way that is beyond any agentic control. A free willist says, well, no, right? If you're truly free, you're not compelled, and all those factors are there. I don't know any free willists that would deny causal factors, but they're left at just that. They're factors. And all those factors lead up to the big moment, right? The moment of agency, where you can look at those factors, weigh them, assess them, and decide to go along with them, or do something crazy and go the other way. And you could genuinely do that. So even though you pick chocolate, and we might understand the reasons for that, going back in this domino sense, you could always fail to flip over that last domino. Like, nope, I'm going to throw monkey wrench in here and pick vanilla. Why? Because I feel like it. Vanilla sounds fun. Right? And it's something different than whatever would otherwise cause a determinant. And I think something like that little bit extra, and I think it's incumbent upon Dr. Curran, and we'll talk about this, to account for what that is, but often it's something like an additional source of causation, an immaterial substance of some sort that's not bound by the laws of physics or nature for that matter, and just somehow it's like a puppeteer, right? It's the man in the box in your brain that can kind of hear all the advice and then decide to go one way or the other. And I ultimately don't think that conception is coherent, even though I do think there's some notion of agency that we'll get at, right? So that's that. To kind of give an account, this is just more entertainment for me, but I've been obsessed with animal trials for a few months. Some of you know about this, but many breeders used to try animals, pigs, locusts, weevils, bugs, and try them with the full force of the law, on the belief that they could do otherwise. This was a period until the 18th century where much of at least Western Europe believed animals had agency, right? And so I want to look at that really quickly because I find it's entertaining. That's just a great picture. Poor pig, right? It's just like, I did what I did, I'm a pig. There are many just entertaining articles. This one I pulled just from Slate. There's an article on Wired that are pretty entertaining, but I'll read just a bit of this to give you some sense of this. So in the fall of 1450, can you all see that? Maybe I'll make it bigger. Poor pig, right? In the fall of 1457, villagers in Savigny, France witnessed a sow and her 6 piglets attack and kill a 5-year-old boy, which I don't know why I'm laughing, that's horrible. Too soon. No, 15th century. Okay, today the animals would be summarily killed, but errant 15th century French pigs went to court. And it wasn't for a show trial. This was the real deal, equipped with a judge, 2 prosecutors, 8 witnesses, and a defense attorney for the accused swine. Witness testimony proved beyond reasonable doubt that the sow had killed the child. The piglet's role, however, was ambiguous. Although splattered with blood, they were never seen directly attacking the boy. The judge sentenced the sow to be hanged by her hind feet from a gallows tree. The piglets, by contrast, were exonerated. And it goes on. Maybe I'll read just this next paragraph. Right? Such a case might seem bizarre to modern observers, but animal trials were commonplace public events in medieval and early modern Europe. Pigs, cows, goats, horses, dogs, and I mentioned intentionally locusts and weevils because they were swarming bugs. They had a lot of trials, so to get individual ones and indict the whole swarm. And what is fascinating, there was an entire legal branch and a few famous, I guess, legal scholars that was their bag. They were known criminal defense attorneys for locusts and weevils. And they got them off all the time. And they apparently had a few different attacks. So one of them was sort of claiming they couldn't help it. And they appealed to our sort of maybe empathy, right? Who would not, if you were going to starve without eating these crops, maybe eat crops that were your own and engage your empathy. The others had to do with they're having other moral justificatory reasons for doing so. But either way, this was serious business. Anyway, so you get that same legal proceedings. In a court of law, they were treated as persons. This is interesting. By that, they mean agents, right? These somber affairs, which always adhere to the strictest legal procedures, reveal a bygone mentality according to which some animals possess moral agency. Now again, just to make the point, I think the reason why we're all laughing, hopefully, because we now do not think animals, at least many animals, definitely not insects, according to most, possess any sort of agency. They could not have done otherwise, so it makes no sense to blame them, let alone try that. I always picture like it being an animal trial, like animals with like, curly white powdered wigs and robes. I'd like to imagine that. But yeah, it just seems absurd, right? That we don't blame them for it, that we may be upset, and maybe what Kyle's getting at is interesting. That in some ways, as much as we're laughing, this becomes a model for many determinists to sort of point to the direction we're heading in. As much as we're laughing now and find it bizarre, and by the way, even cruel, if we really get into it, in fact, one more recent one, I want to say just 19th century, was an elephant who stampeded and killed people and they hung it. They had to bring in a crane and sentenced it to death by hanging and hung an elephant, right? Right, bizarre, right? So there's a cruelty element or whatever, but what many determinists are saying, we may look back 100, 200, 500 years and think the same exact thing about our entire criminal justice system. But rather than seeing them as well victims of their own biology, not satisfying the could do otherwise condition, yet we still treated them that way. How brutal, right? How barbaric were we? So there's sort of a cautionary tale amidst the humor that I think is worth hearing, right? That it's possible we may come to view it that way. But either way, the reason why we're chuckling is because we generally don't think of it that way. We don't think it makes sense to charge, especially the piglets. And by the way, some of the piglets in another account that I just read were considered guilty because they hadn't intervened to stop the other pig from killing the child, and they squealed, which they took as a sign of their exhilaration and delight. So they said, well, clearly they're not just condoning, they're complicit and almost like egging the sow on. These pigs got off, thankfully. You get the point. So back to this. So as far as the metaphysical thesis that I sort of want to address, I think Kyle's right? That the metaphysical thesis about free will, that there's this extra substance that's beyond what causal determinism can show, that's really causing things, I think that's mostly problematic. And I would say incoherent, but I think there's some interesting models. But I want to tease apart the other, which I'm calling the phenomenological, which I haven't mentioned, which is more what Kyle was getting at with the experience, right? The thing we all did when we did the whatever ridiculous thing we did. But what that feels like, the sort of what it's like to experience that sort of freedom, I think we can give an account of. That's still robust, even within a causally determinist system. So we'll see how that goes. Animal trials, I wish I could do more. Oh, we're not doing this. I'll just say one word. I want to talk about this, maybe we'll give other examples, but I thought Kyle might do a few examples that illustrate basically the bottom-up causation at the level of the brain, right? That our brain causes our thoughts, not the other way around. Our thoughts are causative of brain stuff. And the example of Phineas Gage, it's just a great name, by the way. That's a $50 name if I've heard one. Phineas Gage. But yeah, 1848, he was a railroad worker who was tamping down dynamite with this iron rod to blow rocks away from the railroad, and the rod shot through his head, through his jaw, behind his eye. Of course, he lost his eye. It still looks pretty great. But he lost his sense of self, and there's some really funny, in fact, I will read it. We have time, whatever. The attending doctor, just the description is phenomenal, but what they said about him is fantastic. This is the doctor that operated him. By the way, he survived, lived another 12 years, and had a fairly normal life, besides the fact that his personality changed. So this is what the doctor said, the report. The equilibrium or balance, so to speak, between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seemed to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, at times pertinaciously obstinate, I don't know what that means, yet capricious and vacillating, devising many plans of future operations which are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned in turn for others appearing more feasible. A child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, he has animal passions, etc., etc. And what the doctor concluded was that he and other people who knew him said he is simply not the same person. His agency had changed, right? What motivated him to act, his conscious deliberations about those actions were all very different. And there are dozens of parallel cases, but what I want to get you to think of is that the deliberations and whatever moments of agency we experience seem to come from the bottom up, right? That if we can change it, if we can change the neural hardware, as it were, we can change the very nature of agency. And that seems to be an argument against the view that somehow, right, there's agency is some puppeteer managing the brain. It seems entirely the other way, as far as I see. But anyway, that's just for fun. So this is it. This is my view of this in one other slide, and I'll wrap up. It may take a while. So I do support the first thesis, as I mentioned, this more phenomenological one, and reject the metaphysical one. So the support for the phenomenological one is that, and by that I just mean the experience. We experience freedom, right? I think we sort of experience freedom on a continuum. As Kyle mentioned, there's some actions that might not be freedom. We're forced to do something. I gave a couple examples in my class the other day. I wrote them down. Maybe I'll just do it. Let's just do it. Yeah, do it. Do it. So when we think of even the same action, right, which at the level, at least certain measurements in the brain would look fairly similar, depending on at least the motor cortices and stuff, but maybe decision making might be a bit different. But we think of these different actions. So raising your arm in your sleep, or what degree of agency? Did you deliberate? Did you intend that? Probably not at all. It'd be a weird thing to say you had some agentic control over that, right? I think you're dreaming and you just flip out. Happened to me last night. I woke myself up. One of those like falling ones, and it was bad. Having your arm forcibly raised by a torturer. Let's say for whatever, I don't know why they would do that. It's just hypothetical, but let's say as part of a torture before they stab you, they raise your arm or something, right? Probably not any control. If anything, your agency is being counteracted. You may fully intend not to do that. In fact, your whole agentic position, I don't want to do this, but I'm being forced beyond my agency. Again, raising your arm to gun to your head. Maybe slightly more agency. You could say no, but you'd be shot. And the scenario seems so stupid. I don't know why this would happen, but imagine this is the case. I was like, raise your arm. Like, no. Like, gun. Like, all right, fine. But you have some control. You could always say no. You could do otherwise in some sense, but it's fettered, right? It's like you're not truly in control in the same way if there were no external threats, as it were, right? Let's say raising your arm commanded by a drill sergeant, maybe a little bit lighter version of the gun to your head, where it's there's pressure, there'd be consequences, so you're probably going to do it. You're in control, and you could say no without maybe losing your life, but you'd probably be still inclined to say no. This one, is sort of an ideological one, raising your arm in a Nazi salute. I don't know why I brought this up. I was at Godwin's law, the first person to mention Hitler loses the argument, so be it. But this one may be done for different reasons by different people. So let's say you remember the Hitler Youth, you do it maybe instinctively, maybe compulsively. You don't even think about it, right? I'm not going to do it. I started thinking, I was like, no, I'm not. Someone does the Sieg Heil, you do it almost without thinking of it. Maybe as you come to do it, there's more of a deliberation about should I do this, should I join the Hitler Youth, whatever. For someone in here to do it, hopefully, we probably couldn't bring ourselves to do it, right? Even just, in mimicking it. Something about the symbolism engages our value system, and now we have a value judgment about an act of agency that impinges upon. Now it's internal, but it's a value judgment that impinges on our ability to do that. Like I was thinking, there's a lot of things I don't know that I even could do it. Right? Saying a racial epithet. Right? It's like you can't bring yourself to do it unless you can, which we'll talk afterwards, but hopefully not. But, right? It's just like you can't bring yourself to do it. And it's still exercising a bit of the will, but there are other factors internal to you bearing upon that. And then something, I guess, more benign, raising your arm to catch a cat, right? You're doing that for a reason, you've intended to do it, not fettered, and so forth. And the only point I want to make there is that that our freedom exists on a continuum, right? That we sometimes experience greater freedom, like just doing it because we thought about it, picking vanilla or raising our arm to get a cat, versus times where it's coerced, or times where we're less consciously aware, simply like in a dream or whatever. And I think that's important. And what I want to say is, philosophers have a duty to do justice to those sorts of what I would call logical differences between our actions. If we say, no, it's all cause, at the end of the day, the description is the same, the level of physics, so there's no difference. I want to say we're losing the sense of is here. It's like a Bill Clinton thing, right? The definition of is. We're saying the is of action is the causal history, neurobiology or physics. I'm saying we're missing something. If that's it, we're saying that's just what agency amounts to. That's what freedom amounts to. It's just the is of physics and this domino effect through history. So we're missing something. Right? I want to do justice to the experience reality of these variations in our exercise of agency, and that's important. So again, to kind of go further, I think many of our more meaningful human endeavors involve this stuff. So cultivating certain virtues and capacities. The sketchy taps into stuff I was talking about with the group yesterday. But some of the stuff we do here at Chafee, the mindset, anyone on the mindset, like workshops and stuff, growth mindset. Yeah, this idea you change your cognitions, you change your views, you cultivate discipline and capacities to follow through, and ultimately, right, that gives you a certain sort of agency. And I think in an ordinary sense of freedom or free will, that's what I'm getting. I think that makes sense to me. And that also is, right, in light of determinism and understanding the way in which human behavior is affected. And it's using that determinism for an intended goal, and I think we can coerce, if you want to say that, or develop human actions towards a goal that way. Still determined, but it's a process that engages notions of freedom and the experience of freedom to get to those outcomes. So it's part of the causal chain, but it's a very unique one. It involves intentions and motives, mental states that themselves can be part of the causal nexus. Fair enough? Really quickly then, why not number 2? Well, indeterminism is interesting, and I think that poses some challenge. Chaos theory, quantum mechanics. I don't think there's a lot there to really shape at least my commitment to determinism, which might be interesting. That I may be more of a determinist than you are. But I think it's fairly compelling. I don't think it makes sense to speak of uncaused causes or breaks in the causal nexus. There might be some randomness or determinacy, but I still see that as part of the broader picture. Right? In the laws of nature as I understand them, there is a reason, if you want to get to that language, why things happen. And if things are even indeterminate, so be it. I don't think that affects the net outcome. So we can discuss that, but I'm just leaving that alone. The issue that I want to pose to Dan especially, and again, I don't want to steal your thunder or poison the well, I don't know, whatever the metaphor is, against you, but I think the biggest problem that I see conceptually, both scientifically and philosophically, is we have to give an account of what this is that is the agent causing our brain or other things to act. This uncaused substance, I think it might be a soul or spirit or something, that itself, right, cannot be completely causally determined because it itself is something that now is not bound by the laws of causation because it is what causes the brain or you to act. And I don't know that it's incoherent, but I don't know what that means. There's this uncaused substance, whatever that is, that itself then somehow comes back into space and time and exerts causal efficacy on, right, neurons and those sorts of things. I don't know what that means. I'm being serious, I'm not being facetious. I don't know. I think an account has to be given of how that would work. How could something that itself is immaterial and uncaused just kind of levitate? And by the way, I had a philosopher in grad school, a colleague, that actually gave an account of this. He actually said it was sort of a causal nexus that hovered around your body. And he even gave some range. He said 3 or 5 feet from your body. right? And he said even it is what accounts for like deja vu and things, and like getting a sense of people before they're there, because somehow your psyche, this causal force, is interacting even beyond your body, right? But the point is, something like that, and I never thought that was coherent, but I think whatever it is has to be made sense of before we can jump on board. What is this uncaused substance that then comes back into space and time and exerts causal efficacy over the natural? Now, by what mechanism does it do that? Can it do that? I don't know what that means. And you can have a free willist account without something like that, but I think there has to be, right, a mechanism for explaining how agency works beyond the known laws of physics and neurobiology. Fair enough? Okay, so that's that. I think that's the big problem. And this is gets more into my interest in philosophy, particularly philosophy of language. And I think you see an interesting parallel here in discussions outside of free will. And example of love comes to mind. I've talked about this if you've had class with me probably quite a bit. But where I think the problem of free will poses a fallacy, a false alternative, or a false dichotomy in a similar way that I've seen with this issue of love. Namely, it's either free will, which is this uncaused metaphysical stuff, or it's determinism. And if it's determinism, free will is an illusion. I don't think those are the only options. Same thing with love, right? I don't think it's either love, the way we understand it, right? Love of the brain, oxytocin, rules of attraction, these sorts of things, or must be some other metaphysical theory, right? The love spell theory of love, where there's magical ether in the air that makes you fall in love, and it's like one way or the other. It's like I don't think either of those options really account for what love is. And to focus on the physics of love, right, or the metaphysics of love, this other theory that's like what love is, I think only detracts from any meaningful discussion about love. I think the language of love, not like love languages, like those creepy relational books, but I mean the idea of where do we discuss love, right? In relationships, through poetry, through literature, through the arts, through the things we say to each other, through little love letters, and the discussion of, the social psychology of those things, and there's other sort of modes of inquiry that bear on that. But I think to say, no, the real issue of love is what causes it, and making the is of love about causation again, right? Is it physics or is it metaphysics? I'm saying that, to me, that's just a meaningless discussion. And I don't want to sabotage this whole discussion, but in some ways I feel the same way about free will. If we focus on either it's, hard determinism, or it's some metaphysical self that floats above I'm like, that's not that interesting. Let's talk about how we engage with our own agency and how we get about cultivating the type of people and type of society we want. So that's my last slide right here, and then we'll sort of wrap up. So this is one model. I don't think it's the best model. It's just one that I could kind of borrow really quickly because I'm still working on some stuff that I'm thinking. But British philosopher, PhD out of Cambridge. He's also a politician in the UK, and he runs an institute. I think it's called the Institute for Future Intelligence. It's a really interesting kind of forward-thinking group. But he says one way to think about when we're talking about free will or free agency that might be helpful and instructive and more pragmatic in the way I'm suggesting is something like this. So he says, let's think of freedom more like intelligence, something you have to greater or lesser degree. Right? Maybe you can cultivate it by doing certain things. Maybe, and by the way, maybe even animals have it to some degree. Interesting studies on chimps where they can, especially in this first step, come up with dozens of solutions to really simple problems, especially when food's involved. And that something like the degree to which you can cultivate these is the degree to which you experience freedom. And freedom is sort of live for you. So the first one, right, ability to generate options. This gets right into the mindset stuff I mentioned earlier. Right, thinking about viable live options for courses of action. And that involves openness, curiosity, creativity, flexibility, innovation, all these sorts of things. And the degree to which you do that, the degree to which, in some ways, you're more free, right? You can choose from many options instead of just having A or B or only A. And then the ability to choose between them, which is more the rational, deliberative process. You're weighing options, consequential reasoning, what will happen if I do this, and it involves a very high order level of thought. And then lastly, your ability to follow through. So those are only as good as your ability to follow through. I might be here to think all day. And we're all hamstrung by one or the other, right? I think of, for me, this last one. Like, I think a lot of stuff. A lot of plans. I guess I'm a dreamer. But yeah, actually making those things happen can be tough. But the point is, the degree to which you cultivate, develop, nurture these capacities, you want to say virtues or capacities, is the degree to which we have a greater degree of freedom in our daily lives. We think of someone born, in a situation where they have none of this, right? You talked about this. Someone who doesn't have access to education or even cultivating critical thinking, has every genetic and sociobiological, cards stacked against them. Right? It's really mitigating their ability to do this stuff. So I think this can be insightful and instructing on how to move forward. So some stuff here. You can follow his literature. He's a pretty interesting guy. But yeah, he gives applications here for the criminal justice system, applications for educational systems that work on encouraging these mindset sort of strategies and cultivating capacities and virtue sort of strategies, and leaving the question of, at the end of the day, sure, is it all physics? Are these all equally caused? Yes. But sort of a big so what? Right? You're still thinking about the business of cultivating character and virtue and becoming the kind of people that we need in the world. So I'll end with that. I hope you find it interesting. Ask questions later. That's it. Thank you.
So Dr. Falcioni, so you were talking about the framework as it stands right now, where it's compatibilism on one hand and determinism on the other, and that it's confused. And what you're trying to do is essentially draw a way out of a confused framework because it misses the point of what we experience on our day-to-day life. Now, let's just say I'm playing devil's advocate here, and I'm not a physicist, but let's just say that I was, and I'm saying, okay, this all sounds well and good, but it just sounds like it's fluff at the end of the day, because we're saying that, the universe abides by certain dictates, and that's just the way it is. How would you respond to me?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, some of that just may, plague our thoughts about it if we think in more deterministic ways.
Right.
But I think that, it's fluff only in the sense that these other activities of human life are fluff.
Right.
Love, compassion, our interests, our hobbies, music. I mean, that sure, you can explain them causally, and to say by explaining them causally, you explain them away or make them fluff. I would say, well, Wittgenstein actually had a good point about this with regard to ethics. He said, at the end of the day, ethics may be meaningless in a technical sense and not being able to prove ethics.
Right.
He said, but it's meaningless stuff that he said, I went for my life ridicule, and later on, I think he said something like, meaninglessness that's worth dying for.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, if the theory can't account for, so hard determinism, let's say, can't account for the depth of and significance of our experience of freedom, I would say all the worse for that view of determinism. That these are the aspects of our lives that are most meaningful. And I don't think the language of determinism is helpful in elucidating those, right? So it's not that determinism isn't true, it's that, like in all things, that the language of the language of particle physics, let's just say, isn't probably the best way to go about trying to understand and explain love.
Right.
And if you're like, no, but at the end of the day, by the way, they're probably right. If we understand the is of the question of what is love to be what causes love, sure, the physicists have it all day.
Right.
I mean, even neurobiologists are way behind it, right? It's physics. But if we say, hey, you really understand everything you need to understand about love by understanding particles in motion. So no, you understand more by reading poets.
Right.
By talking to somebody in love. Hopefully by experiencing love. And so I think, I do have a more phenomenological or existential experiential view of a lot of these is when it comes to these areas of human experience. And I just privilege that. But I think it intuitively makes sense. I don't think anyone in here would say, you learn a lot more about love by talking to a physicist at Caltech.
Right.
And you may learn a lot about what causes love. That's very interesting. But that's not what I'm talking about. Or any of us are talking about when we're actually talking about love. So I think what happens is, and Dr. Kuhn is a certain reductionism where almost every question then becomes what causes it. And that becomes a surrogate for a more meaningful discussion about what is it, how to experience it, or whatever. So the is, I'll grant, in terms of causation, goes to physics. Let's move on and talk about what actually our experiences of free will or love or the arts or anything meaningful is. And I think the is there is the more meaningful is.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that just to utilize the word fluff, it has a pejorative term, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, a negative connotation to it. And it's one thing to describe the process, but it's quite another to actually experience love or music or anything that kind of animates your being in a way that that reminds you of what it's like to actually be alive. Because you don't get that same feeling from deconstructing a physics equation or anything like that. Yeah,
I think that's right. So I think the meaningful parts of it are, in that area of discourse and discussion. So free will, I think you'd do better to read the existentialists than you would to read the physicists or neurobiologists. Now, not that you shouldn't read those. Again, I'm like most of us really interested in that. And I'm writing I just finished a book chapter on the science of ethics, and I'm really interested in this, right? What causes our ethical views and our motivations to act and so on. But in addition to that, I think there's the really probably a more interesting discussion about what actually is going on, how we experience that, what that means to us, how that shapes our lives. And there's also a science to that.
Right.
But I think the most meaningful discussion isn't always science. I mean, so this problem only emerges, and I know Sam Harris and other people on this topic kind of popularized this notion. Free will is an illusion, right? The first thing I thought when I saw that, and there's other books called that, Free will is an illusion. You've seen YouTube videos?
Yeah.
I think it's only an illusion if you begin with the assumption that the only meaningful question about free will is what causes it. Right? It's a question of causation. So you reduce the phenomenological question to that physical question. And then if that's the truth, then it is an illusion or it's irrelevant or whatever. I'm saying that you're missing the forest for the tree.
I see.
There's a sleight of hand here. I'm not interested when I say what is free will and the physics of free will. I mean, that's interesting, but that's not what I'm talking about as a philosopher, as an ethicist, right?
Okay. I have a few more questions, but I do want to get going.
Dr. Kern.
All right, thank you very much.
Oh, there we go. So let's just start. A lot of this we've already covered, so I'll go pretty quickly. What does free will do? It causes actions, i.e., for a very simple action, Bob presses a button. Now I'm going to come back to this. This is a specific case that I'm going to talk about. The debate centers around the cause of Bob's action. So here's some possible explanations for Bob's action. Number one, Bob's action was determined by the laws of classical physics and neural states. That's determinism, which we've heard a lot about. Bob's action was controlled by the laws of quantum physics, but not determined. This kind of a new position is called indeterminism. 3, Bob's action was determined by the laws of physics, but he was still free. That's compatibilism. And finally, Bob's action was not determined or controlled by the laws of physics or anything else. Bob's mind, consciousness, self brought about the action. That's called libertarianism. So the position I'm defending here is libertarianism. This was brought up a couple times. How do philosophers fall in this? So this is a survey that was done on philpapers.com in 2009. So the options are accept or lean toward compatibilism, 59.1% of the respondents, 900 respondents. Other was 14%. I'm not sure what they were thinking of. What other would think? Accept or lean toward libertarianism, 13%. Accept or lean toward no free will, 12%. So we can't really say that most philosophers are hardcore determinists. The majority seem to be compatibilists. I'm not sure why that. Well, I have thoughts about why that would be, but it's interesting. That's where the professional philosophers fall within this debate currently. So now I just want to go through each of the explanations and do some assessment of the explanation as an explanation of Bob's action. Okay. So number 1, Bob's action was determined by the laws of classical physics and neural states, which is determinism. The problem with this, which has been mentioned by both the other panelists, is that the laws of classical physics have been superseded by the laws of quantum physics, which are not deterministic. There's no prediction of future states of quantum particles as possible. For instance, the decay of a radioisotope, there's no way to predict that. It just happens. They include the possibility, now this is a debatable point, but there's of 3 contemporary views of quantum physics, this is one of the contemporary views that's held by many quantum physicists at least. They include the possibility of non-physical consciousness affecting the physical outcome of experiments. This is, again, this is an interpretation of what happens in certain quantum physics experiments, but it's an interpretation that fits the facts. This is Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the founders of quantum physics. This is what he said. The only acceptable point of view, given quantum physics, appears to be the one that recognizes both sides of reality, the quantitative and the qualitative, the physical and the psychical, as compatible with each other and can embrace them simultaneously. This is a long quote, but it has to do with the effect of quantum physics. It is very small for you. Okay, so I'm just going to read this. Neuropsychological research on the neural basis of behavior generally posits that physical brain mechanisms will ultimately suffice to explain all psychologically described phenomena. Thus, terms having an intrinsic mentalistic and/or experiential content, e.e. feeling, knowing, and effort, are not included as primary causal factors. This is my italics. This theoretical restriction is motivated primarily by ideas about the natural world that have been known to be fundamentally incorrect for more than 3/4 of a century. Contemporary basic physical theory differs profoundly from classical physics on the important matter of how the consciousness of human agents enters into the structure of empirical phenomena. The new principles contradict the older idea that local mechanical principles alone can account for the structure of all observed empirical data. Contemporary quantum physical theory brings directly and irreducibly into the overall causal structure certain psychologically described choices made by human agents about how they will act. Indeed, owing to certain structural features of ion channels critical to synaptic function, contemporary quantum physical theory must in principle be used when analyzing human brain dynamics. The new framework, unlike its classical physics-based predecessor, is erected directly upon and is compatible with the prevailing quantum principles of physics. It is able to represent more adequately than classical concepts the neuroplastic mechanisms relevant to the growing number of empirical studies of the capacity of directed attention and mental effort to systematically alter brain function. Okay? So that's one, that's actually two people, and their names are Henry Stapp and Jeffrey Schwartz, who are working in this area. So there's big problems with using classical deterministic physics as a way of saying there is no free will, because classical deterministic physics, there's stuff going on at the neural level of the brain that's in the quantum level of reality. So you have to think about the quantum physics things. Which leads to the second possibility, which is Bob's action was controlled by the laws of quantum physics, but not determined, which is indeterminism. The problem, as Kyle mentioned, is that quantum physics effects seem to be random, and this would make it, so if we're basing it just on quantum physics, that would seem to make our choices random, which isn't much better than determined in terms of freedom. So quantum physics doesn't save free will, and if it's only quantum physics at the basis of everything, then we're in a random situation, which isn't really any better. I'm going to talk about now compatibilism, which claims Bob's action was determined by the laws of physics, but he was free, which is compatibilism. As I mentioned, this is the majority of view among philosophers. 60% of professional philosophers claim to be compatibilists. The problem, I think, is that compatibilism is logically contradictory. I think it's a self-defeating position. So it's something like this. The position of compatibilism is something like this. If Bob had decided or wanted or desired to do other words, so we're thinking about Bob pushing a button, right? If Bob had decided, wanted, or desired to do other words, he would have done otherwise. Therefore, Bob is free. But this argument fails upon the question, given the laws of physics in the past history of the universe, could Bob have decided or wanted or desired to do otherwise? So backing it up one level and saying it was Bob's desires that brought about his action isn't any better than saying Bob's neurons brought about his action. If his desires are themselves neural states, then it's still a physicalist explanation of Bob's action. So saying Bob, I mean, maybe you could say if Bob could have done otherwise, he's free, but the problem is in a deterministic explanation, Bob couldn't do otherwise. That's the whole point of determinism. All of Bob's past and future states are determined by the laws of classical physics according to determinism. So no one could ever do otherwise. We might think we do otherwise. That's why some contemporary people say free will is an illusion. Because we think we could do otherwise, we feel like we could do otherwise, but if determinism is true, we can't do otherwise. Nobody can do anything other than what they did. So compatibilism, so if you take this, you say, could Bob have done otherwise? If the answer is no, Bob couldn't have decided or wanted or desired to do otherwise, then the person's a determinist. They're not a compatibilist. If they say yes, but only due to quantum indeterminism, then the arguer is an indeterminist, which is the second position. If the answer is yes, Bob really could have done otherwise, then the person must be a libertarian, which is the third position, or the fourth position. So I find compatibilism to be a non-starter as a position because it just, to me, is contradictory. It seems that it reduces, if you push a compatibilist, they must become a determinist, an indeterminist, or a libertarian, one of those other three positions. Now, we get to the last position. And I'm going to agree with Ryan right off. Agent causation is a strange thing, right? And so I'll grant that right off. The question is whether it's required by the data that we have. So I'm going to take a look at that. So here's a couple of quotes about agent causation. Agent causation is an ontologically primitive type of causation, one that is uniquely manifested by some possible persons and inherently goal-directed and non-deterministic. It is not directed to any particular effects, but instead confers upon an agent a power to cause a certain type of event within the agent, the coming to be of a state of intention to carry out some act, thereby resolving a state of uncertainty about which action to undertake. So, as Ryan helpfully said, the agent, the argument here will be the agent is a non-physical substance that can, and it's, I think we'll have to talk about it. To be honest, no agent causation believer knows how a non-physical agent can affect the physical brain. That's a mystery, and any proper agent causation supporter will admit that's a mystery. This next one is from Roderick Chisholm, who's a famous philosopher from the 60s. He says, now he connects it to responsibility, which I think we should talk more about later. If we are responsible, that is morally and legally responsible for our actions, and if what I've been saying is true, then we have a prerogative which some would attribute only to God. Each of us, when we act, is a prime mover unmoved. In doing what we do, we cause certain events to happen, like pushing a button, and nothing or no one causes us to cause those events to happen. That's the principle of agent causation. There's an agent, a non-physical agent that starts a chain reaction of neural networks in the brain that brings about an action. So I just want to talk about some evidence for libertarianism. Our own experience. We experience ourselves making freedom. Now I'm going to agree with Kyle that our experience often goes wrong. So I'm not claiming that our experience is a definitive no. So that's a problem. Our own experience is sometimes wrong. For instance, we experience the Earth as the center of the solar system and everything revolving around it. But the fact that we experience freedom and the reason for it must be demonstrated very clearly. Sorry, that's written badly. The fact that we don't experience, that we don't have freedom, and what follows from that must be demonstrated very carefully. And it can be proven mathematically. The planetary motion, the planetary system has been shown empirically to be true. So that hasn't been shown for free will. Okay. Moral and legal responsibility requires free will. Again, I think this is worth talking about. This is not in itself an argument for free will, but it underscores the central place free will has in our personal and social lives. The belief in free will is so important that it should not be given up without very strong evidence. Such evidence is not at present available. So both of these reasons, experience and responsibility, are not in themselves definitive arguments that we have free will. But they're very important parts of human existence, so I would encourage you not to give them up easily, because they're so important. I'm gonna go slightly on a sidetrack and talk about consciousness for a moment. Consciousness and free will are not exactly the same thing, but they're very closely connected. So an argument for a non-physical consciousness can be taken as support for the existence of a non-physical free will. So I'm going to be mostly talking about the philosopher David Chalmers and what he calls the hard problem of consciousness. So again, I say consciousness is not the same as free will, but it's closely linked. The easy problem of consciousness for Chalmers is correlating conscious states with brain states, i.e. seeing yellow correlates to neuron firings XYZ. There's lots of good work. Take any conscious state, seeing a color, hearing a sound, and neurophysiologists are very good at saying this is what's going on in the brain when that person is having that experience. That's the easy problem, correlating brain states to conscious states. The hard problem is explaining why neuron firings XYZ are accompanied by the conscious subjective experience of seeing yellow. Neuron firings are not the same thing as seeing yellow. So it's very important. This is a very important point. To say neurons XYZ are firing in your brain, neurons don't see yellow. So the question is, what sees yellow? It's not your neurons. Your brain doesn't see yellow. Your neurons don't see yellow. What is it that is seeing yellow? Well, I'm going to use an illustration with sound. Okay? So when I speak, I create sound waves. Sound waves are physical. They're physical processes, movement of physical particles. Now this is from a site about the ear. It tells you what the ear does. When these sound waves reach your ears, quote, the sound waves travel from the outer ear and in through the auditory canal, causing the eardrum or the tympanic membrane to vibrate, physical. This in turn causes three small bones known as the ossicles, or the hammer and the anvil and the stirrup, in the middle ear to move, physical. The vibrations move via the oval window through the fluid of the cochlea in the inner ear, stimulating thousands of tiny hair cells. That's all physical. This results in the transformation of the vibrations into electrical impulses in neurons in the brain. That's all physical, right? So, my question to you is, where is the sound? There is no sound anywhere in that process. That is a purely physical process. So the question is, this goes back to Berkeley's famous conundrum, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make any sound? The argument is, if there were no conscious observer, there would be no sound. Sound requires consciousness. So the physical structures of the world cannot account for sound, the hearing of a sound. All they can account for is physical processes. These are the problems. These are all physical processes. The brain works by electrical signals traveling through neuronal synapses, but electrical signals in neurons and synapses are physical. Where is the sound? It is conceivable that you could have all of the physical processes without any sound. That means that the physical process can't be the sound. Brains don't hear, they process data. Only a non-physical consciousness can hear. So here's a conclusion in a small argument. In order for there to be sound, there must be a non-physical consciousness. There is sound. I hear sound right now. Therefore, there is a non-physical consciousness. This is from a neuroscientist, recent work. This is published in 2013. This is what he says. This is about sight, seeing things. Different visual features, color, size, shape, motion, etc., are computed by large distinct neural circuits. But we experience an integrated whole. This is closely related to the problem known as the illusion of a stable visual world. There is now overwhelming biological and behavioral evidence that the brain contains no stable, high-resolution, full-field representation of a visual scene. That's a complex but important statement. You should listen to it. The brain contains no stable, high-resolution, full-field representation of a visual scene, even though that is what we subjectively experience. The structure of the primate visual system has been mapped in detail, and there is no area that could encode this detailed information. The subjective experience, thus, is inconsistent with the neural circuitry. That's he italicized the word inconsistent there. Again, the subjective experience of seeing a scene is inconsistent with the neural circuitry of the brain. So this is from a neurophysicist. Conclusion, this is back to Chalmers. Explaining structure and function in the brain is insufficient for explaining consciousness. Explaining neural correlates of consciousness is not explaining consciousness. The question is, why do we have subjective personal experience accompanying all the brain stuff that's going on? This doesn't deny the connection between brain stuff and consciousness. They're very closely connected. But the brain mapping can never fully explain consciousness because consciousness is a different type of thing. Now, I want to go back to Bob pushing the button. There have been some experiments in the last 10 or 20 years that seem to imply that free will is not as robust, at least. Many people take these to be proving that free will doesn't exist. So I want to take this head on and take one of the most famous ones and show how there's different ways to interpret it. So this is a brain study. Bob had to push a button with his left or his right hand. So on this here, 10 seconds before Bob, or 7 or 8 seconds before Bob thought he was going to push the button or had the conscious intention to push the button, there was a firing in this micropatterns of brain activity in the prefrontal cortex. The experimenters could predict with 60% accuracy, 7 seconds before Bob thought he chose which button to push, which button Bob was going to push. So 7 seconds before Bob made a decision, a conscious decision, the experimenters predicted with 60% accuracy which button Bob would push. So I'm just going to read. This is just summarizing that again. In the 7 seconds before Haynes' test, subjects chose to push a button. Actually, I'm going to skip that because I already explained it. But this is what the experimenter himself, Haynes, said about this. According to the experimenter, Haynes, real-life decisions, am I going to buy this house or that one, take this job or that one, aren't decisions that we can implement very well in our brain scanners, said Haynes. Also, the predictions were not completely accurate. They were 60%. Maybe free will enters at the last moment, allowing a person to override an unpalatable subconscious decision. We can't rule out that there's a free will that kicks in at this late point, said Haynes, who intends to study this phenomenon next, but I don't think it's plausible. Another neuroscientist, Sugar, this is his description, or his response. It is widely assumed that the neural decision to move coincides with the onset of readiness potential, which given its slow nonlinear character is difficult to pinpoint. Our model challenges that. This is from another experimenter, another neurophysicist experimenter. Our model challenges that assumption by suggesting that the neural decision to move now might come very late in the time course of the readiness potential. Prior research shows an involvement of motor areas, including primary motor cortex in the motor imagery, in the absence of overt movement. So even without overt movement, you get activity in your primary motor cortex. Thus, movement-specific activity in motor cortex, even primary motor cortex, although it might vary with the probability that a movement will occur, does not necessarily signal the final commitment to produce a movement now. Thus, according to our model, uncued movements in a task like Libet's or Haynes tends to be preceded by a gradual increase in neural activity, whose causal role is incidental, not directed consciously or otherwise at producing a movement. One other one. It is sometimes claimed that certain experiments show that free will is an illusion by showing that all decisions are made unconsciously. I have argued elsewhere that these experiments do not show that any decisions are made unconsciously, but suppose I'm wrong about that. Even then I argue these experiments do not pose a serious threat to free will. First, one is not warranted in generalizing from finding about the decisions allegedly made in these experiments to the claim that all decisions are unconsciously made. Second, even if all decisions were made unconsciously, the findings are compatible with a modest time lag hypothesis about our conscious detection of decisions we make, and the supposed truth of that hypothesis is compatible with our making some of our decisions freely. So there's a lot of debate about these studies. The jury's not in. So my very bold conclusion is, don't give up on free will yet. All right, that's all.